So welcome to Jumbo IS and welcome to Union Budget 2025-26 Part 2. If you haven't watched Part 1, then for watching this lecture, it is very important for you to watch Part 1. Part 1 covers the basics of budget and you need to be familiar with those basics to understand Part 2. Alright? So please, before watching this lecture, you need to watch Part 1 and that is very important. You can find Part 1 in our YouTube playlist called Union Budget. Okay, so there is a separate playlist created for budget series. Just click on that playlist. You will find Union Budget 2025-26 Part 1. It is very important. I repeat that again. Very important for you to watch Part 1 first before starting with Part 2. Okay, otherwise you will not understand most of the things in this lecture. All right. Now, this part would be basically focused on key highlights. Okay, key highlights of the budget. Now, before starting with key highlights of this budget, let's revise a little bit, which was discussed in part 1. Let's revise those contents a little bit. So, in part 1, we covered the format of budget. Okay, budget is nothing about receipts and expenditure of the government, right? It's nothing but receipts and expenditure of the government. Now, these receipts and expenditures are divided into two parts. Revenue account, so we have revenue receipts and revenue expenditure. Capital account, capital receipts and capital expenditure. Now, basically the reason why budget is divided into these two parts, revenue account and capital account, is because it is mentioned in the Constitution of India. As you all know, the power to make budget or the responsibility to present budget every year comes from Article 112 of the Constitution. And this 112 article also mentions that budget as presented in Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, both houses of the parliament, budget shall be presented in a format in which it is divided into two parts, revenue account and capital account. So our budget kind of looks like this. Okay, there is revenue account and there are revenue receipts and revenue expenditure. There is capital account and there are capital receipts and capital expenditure. As far as revenue receipts are concerned, well, some receipts are in the form of taxes, some are non-tax receipts. For example, profits earned by government through its companies, fees and fines, okay, interest payments received on loans given by government to some other entity, right? All these are included in non-tax. Similarly, in capital account, the capital receipts are of two types. If the government of India has taken any loan, then that would be a capital receipt, but that would be debt creating capital receipt. And if government of India has taken money, but that doesn't increase debt on government of India, right? For example, government of India sold Air India company and it received some money out of it. Then those receipts would be non-debt creating because they don't increase any debt on the government or create any debt on the government, right? We covered these basics, right? These are the basics of every budget. Now, in today's lecture, we'll focus on this year's budget. How many revenue receipts have been collected? How many capital receipts have been collected? What are the trends in revenue account as far as receipts are concerned? Are government receipts increasing year on year or are they declining year on year? Is tax revenue increasing year on year or is it declining year on year? So in today's lecture, we'll talk about these trends and some basic facts which are important for you to know because an MCQ might be created out of them, out of those facts, okay? And you should be able to answer those MCQs in your prelims examination. Now, okay, so we'll talk about these things, these trends, these figures, okay? Now, let's first talk about receipts, okay? Both revenue receipts and capital receipts. So as far as the total receipts of the government are concerned, you should know this, okay? As far as the total receipts of the government are concerned, government receives the most money by borrowing it, okay? Borrowing and other liabilities forms the number one component of total receipts, okay? This is number one. Then number two is income tax collections, okay? Number three is GST. Number four is corporate income tax or corporation tax, okay? And then so on and so forth, okay? Union excise duty, which is an indirect tax, customs duty, non-debt capital receipts like sale of Air India and all that, non-tax receipts, which are part of revenue account, okay? Now, borrowing and other other liabilities are capital receipts. Income tax is revenue receipt. GST is revenue receipt. Corporation tax is revenue receipt. Okay, union excise duty is revenue receipt. Non-tax receipts, well, revenue receipt. Non-debt capital receipts, well, as the name suggests, capital receipts, they are capital receipts. Custom duty, well, revenue receipts. Okay. Now, if a question is asked in your prelims examination that government receives more money from revenue receipts than capital receipts, true or false, then you'll say revenue receipts. You'll call it true. It receives more money from revenue receipts. As you can see, income tax, all these things. Maximum revenue comes from revenue receipts. 22% over here, 18% GST. This is 40% and 17%. So 57% of government's revenue comes from income tax, GST and corporation tax alone. All right. Make sense? So if this question is asked, you know the answer. Okay. So remember these trends. Remember these ranks. The highest revenue, highest receipts come from borrowings. Then it's income tax, then GST, then corporation tax. Another question might be asked. They might ask you that which tax delivers the most revenue for the government. So you will say income tax. Okay. Some people get confused. They think it's GST. Though income tax and GST are quite close. But this time around, it's income tax. Okay. So these questions can be extracted from this pie chart alone. So remember this pie chart. Okay. Now, this is all about total receipts. Now let's talk about total expenditure. Okay. So the number one expenditure of Government of India is state share of taxes and duties. So the thing is that central government collects a lot of money through taxes. Okay. Now, as a part of their duty, they have to share some of that amount with state governments of India. Now, how much would that amount be? Well, that is decided by Finance Commission of India. Okay, so Finance Commission will decide how much money that is collected by central government through taxes alone, will be devolved to state government. Okay. Now, Finance Commission makes that decision, and currently it's around 42%, 42, 43%. Okay, but this might change when the new Finance Commission would give a new order. Any which way. So, the biggest expenditure for central government is giving money to state government from this fund. This fund is made by collection of taxes that goes towards central government. Okay, so it is 22%. Then 20% is interest payments. Now, what are these interest payments? Central government has borrowed a lot, as you can see in these receipts. The biggest receipt is borrowings. Now, these borrowings are a liability because you have to pay interest on it, right? Now, if your borrowings are your number one receipt, then naturally interest payments on those borrowings would be in top two. Okay, so interest payments form 20% of this. Clear? Then 16% is central sector scheme. These are developmental schemes. Okay. Then it's 8% of defense expenditure, 8% of centrally sponsored scheme. Okay. And so on and so forth. Finance Commission and other transfers. So Finance Commission also tells you how much taxes would you give to the state government. Finance Commission also talks about grants, that how many grants you'll give to state governments. So these grants form 8%. Okay. Tax devolution forms 22%, which is a lot. Okay. And then there are other expenditure, pensions and all that stuff. Clear? So number one is devolution to states. Okay. Number two is interest payments. Okay. Just remember this. And for your revision from the previous lecture, well, let's categorize each and every expenditure, whether it's revenue expenditure or capital. So state share of taxes and duties, revenue expenditure. Okay. Interest payments, revenue expenditure. Central sector scheme, excluding capital outlay on defense. So excluding capital expenditure on central sector scheme, mostly revenue expenditure, but it can be capital also. So if these central sector schemes are building assets or they are building roads, bridges, then it would be capital expenditure. If it is normal day-to-day expenditure under these central sector schemes, revenue. Subsidies, revenue expenditure. Defense can also be revenue and capital. If you're buying weapons and tanks and aircrafts, capital expenditure. If you're buying ration for armed forces personnel, if you're paying salaries of armed forces personnel, revenue expenditure. Okay. Finance Commission and other transfers, well, these include grants, revenue expenditure. Centrally sponsored scheme, again, if under a centrally sponsored scheme you are building buildings, roads, bridges, then capital expenditure. If it is normal day-to-day expenditure, revenue expenditure. Pensions, revenue expenditure. Okay. So this is total expenditure. Now, as far as the trends in receipts are concerned, well, revenue receipts and capital receipts. Revenue receipts of Government of India are rising, okay, as far as this budget is concerned. Though, as compared to 2024-25 or the estimate made in 2024-25 and the actual amount collected, there is a difference, okay. But revenue receipts are showing a increasing trend. Capital receipts are showing a declining trend. Okay, so you're not receiving much money from capital receipts. But this can be good news also, because most of these capital receipts are loans taken by the government. And if loans taken by the government are showing a declining trend, that's good news, right? And most of these revenue receipts are tax receipts. And if tax receipts are showing an increasing trend, that's good news. So all in all, it's good news. By the way, notice one more thing. These figures are in lakh crore. So revenue receipts for the year 2025-26 are going to be 34.2 lakh crore. And capital receipts are going to be 16.4 lakh crore. So as you can see, capital receipts are half of revenue receipts. If this question is asked, are revenue receipts more than capital receipts? Then you will say true. Okay. Then let's look at expenditure also. Okay. Now, revenue expenditure is showing a rise. Okay. And this is bad. Why? Because that means government expenditure on subsidies, government expenditure on salaries, pensions, interest payments on loans taken previously. This is increasing, and this is really bad news for government. Okay. But capital expenditure is showing almost an increasing trend. Almost. As compared to previous year, it is showing an increasing trend. Okay. Now, over here, you have to take a look at this word, effective capital expenditure. Now, this is very important. Okay. We all know capital expenditure, but what is the meaning of this word effective over here? Okay. Now, hear me out carefully. Now, capital expenditure is that expenditure which is done to build assets for the government. Okay. Assets like roads, bridges, electricity infrastructure, urban infrastructure, water infrastructure, digital infrastructure like UPI, DigiLocker, Aadhaar, and all that. All these are assets, and the money spent on them is capital expenditure. Okay. But as I have told you before, that grants given to states, okay, finance commission and other transfers, which means grants given to states, is revenue expenditure. Okay. But what if these grants that are given to states use those grants to build assets? Now, building assets is a good thing. That is why economists actually encourage government to increase their capital expenditure and reduce their revenue expenditure. Okay. But the thing is that we want to see how many assets is the government building. Okay. Now, capital expenditure gives you that idea. But some of the revenue expenditure, which is used by state government to build assets, is also building assets. Okay. So basically, what is effective effective capital expenditure? So effective capital expenditure is capital expenditure by central government plus grants to states used to build assets. Okay. Technically, all grants fall under revenue expenditure. Okay. But if those grants are used to build assets, to build capital assets, okay, then this would be added to capital expenditure of union government, and it would be called, a new category would be created, effective capital expenditure. So effective expenditure, if effective capital expenditure is increasing, this is basically a good news for the government. Why? That means government of India and state governments, overall, both governments, or overall all governments in India, are building more assets. And building of assets is good news for the economy, right? So it is good that effective capital expenditure is increasing, is showing a rising trend. But this is bad news for the government, that revenue expenditure is also increasing, because revenue expenditure doesn't build any asset. Okay. As far as economists are concerned, they consider revenue expenditure to be wasteful expenditure. Okay. But they consider capital expenditure to be useful, good for the economy, good for the GDP expenditure. Okay. So this is bad as far as economists are concerned. It might be good for government employees because their salaries are increasing, pensions are increasing. Okay. It might be good for people because their subsidies are increasing. But as far as GDP and economists are concerned, it is bad, considered to be bad. Okay. Now, in the previous lecture, we did talk about deficits. Okay. Now, all different types of deficits like fiscal deficit, revenue deficit, effective revenue deficit, primary deficit, all these deficits are showing a declining trend, which is good news for the government. Because what are deficits? Okay. If your expenditure is more than your receipts, okay, then the difference between your expenditure and receipts is a deficit. That means you're spending more than you are earning. Now, if you're spending around 200 and you're earning around 160, then this 40 rupees is your deficit. And where do you get this extra 40 to spend? Okay, if you're earning only 160, then where does this extra 40 come from? Well, you have to borrow it. Therefore, these deficits are declining is good news. Why? Because if deficits are low, you need to borrow less. And if borrowings are low, then debt on you is low. And if debt on you is low, then future interest payments for these debts, which is part of revenue expenditure, would also decline. And that is overall a good news. Okay. Reduced debt on government is good news. It is important for the stability of the country. Plus, if the government has low debt, then even foreign investors and even domestic investors are confident about India. If India's debt is low, then foreign investors are very happy investing in India. So if India's debt profile declines, or if India's debt burden declines, well, that would definitely boost foreign investment in India, which is good for India's GDP or economy at large, right? So the declining trends in deficits is very good news. All right. Now, sources of deficit financing. What do you mean? I told you that 40 rupees is this deficit. Now, where is this money coming from? Okay. Well, this money is coming from borrowings, right? But borrowings can also be of different types. Okay. There are some short-term borrowings. Then government borrows directly from the market, okay, through banks and loans. Then there are other types of borrowings. Then there are securities against small savings. Look, you, I, and many other Indians actually save our money in Provident Fund. Okay, PF, EPF, okay, National Savings Certificate. We save our money over here because these funds provide us with good interest rates. And for we can save our money in these funds for long term. Okay, so for 10-20 years, and after 10-20 years, you'll get a lot of money back, right? Because you'll be paid interest on it. Now, this interest is paid by the government. So can I say the money you are depositing in Provident Fund, because Government of India is paying an interest on it, so it's kind of debt for government, right? So small savings, PF, National Savings Certificate, all of this form a very important chunk of government's borrowings. Then the most dominant portion of government borrowings is market borrowings. You have to just remember this, okay? Most of the money to finance deficits comes from market borrowings. Okay, government sells government securities basically. Clear? Okay. Now let's move forward. Let's talk about trends in net receipts of the center. So net receipts are showing an increasing trend. Okay. The maximum share in net receipts is that of center's tax revenue. Clear? Plus, this trend is also important. What? Transfers to states and UTs are also increasing. That means central government is transferring more money to state governments. And this should be good news for the state government. Why? Because now they'll have more money to fund many of its welfare programs. Okay, so this is also good news. This is also good news that states are receiving more money. An increasing trend is being seen here. All right. Now, as far as expenditure is concerned, total expenditure is concerned, then let's talk about sectoral distribution of this expenditure. So most of the expenditure is done on defense. Then next is rural development. Then next is taken by Home Affairs, Ministry of Home Affairs, which handles police, intelligence agencies, paramilitary forces like CRPF, Assam Rifles, Sashastra Seema Bal, Border Security Force, all that. Then agriculture, then education, health, and the least amount of expenditure is done on scientific departments, research and development, scientific innovation. This is bad news that we spend so little on innovation, research and development. Okay, we need to increase that if India wants to become a Vikasit Desh or developed country by 2047. Because powerful countries all over the world are tech superpowers too. They're not just military superpowers, they are tech superpowers. So if India wants to become a superpower, it needs to be a tech superpower. And India will become tech superpower if government allocates more money to scientific departments. Though, nonetheless, military superpower, becoming military superpower is also important, and that is why most of the expenditure is done on defense. Now, you might be asked MCQs from it, okay? And you can imagine what kind of MCQs can come from this. You should be aware of these trends. At least remember the top three and the bottom three expenditures, okay? Sectoral distribution. All right. Now, as far as important trends are concerned, so as far as tax receipts are concerned, they are showing an increasing trend. As far as capital expenditure is concerned, it is also showing an increasing trend, which is good news. We saw that effective capital expenditure was showing an increasing trend. Transfer to states is showing an increasing trend. And as far as composition of these transfers are concerned, what amount of money is being transferred to the government? Then tax devolution forms the number one source. Okay. Then grants, and other sources like centrally sponsored schemes, scheme related transfer to states, they form the lower portion. Okay, but you should know that the maximum amount of money that is transferred to states comes from tax devolution. These are some of the important facts that you need to be aware of. But you will be able to understand these important trends if you have watched part 1 of our budget series. Okay, so I'll again repeat, if some of you who haven't watched part 1 but continued with part 2, well, I'll tell you again at the end of this lecture that please watch part 1. It would really open your eyes as far as basics of budget are concerned. Okay, and that would be all. With that, we come to an end of part 2. Okay. In part 3, we will cover some other aspects related to Union Budget 2025-26. And I promise you guys, I'll also come out with a set of MCQs from this year's budget. Okay, because MCQs are important for this year's prelims, right? So I'll come out with some probable MCQs, most important MCQs from this year's budget, so that you'll get some MCQ practice from budget, and you'll also get to revise Union Budget through those MCQs. And who knows, maybe some of those MCQs might feature in your prelims examination. You never know. At least you should be prepared for that. All right. Okay. So I'll be signing off now. Thank you so much, everyone.